What if the strange things outside your house were never random? What if someone has been trying to mark your life, silently, spiritually, from the shadows? An ex-occult insider once revealed that certain objects are not decorations, not accidents, not harmless trash, but spiritual signals used in dark rituals. Why do attacks begin after these signs appear? Why does confusion suddenly enter homes that once had peace? Tonight, hidden works of darkness are being exposed. And if you ignore these warnings, you may leave a spiritual door open that was never meant to remain unlocked. There are moments when you step outside your house and something immediately feels wrong. Not because of what you see at first, but because of what you feel. A sudden heaviness, a strange tension in the atmosphere, an unexplainable discomfort pressing against your spirit. Then your eyes notice it, something lying near the gate, something placed near the doorstep, something that should not be there. And most people ignore it. They kick it aside, they laugh at it, they treat it like trash. But what if it was never random? What if somebody intentionally left it there for a spiritual reason? Former occult practitioners have testified that dark rituals often begin with physical contact points. Objects become symbols, symbols become invitations, and invitations become access points for spiritual oppression. Because darkness always seeks agreement. That is why certain items are left outside homes, not because the object itself has power, but because it represents intention. And intention in the spiritual realm is dangerous. Some people suddenly begin experiencing constant arguments after finding strange powders near their entrance. Others discover bizarre bundles wrapped with thread, hair, feathers, or pieces of cloth. Then the atmosphere inside the home changes. Peace disappears. Sleep becomes difficult. Fear increases. Confusion spreads. And nobody understands why everything shifted overnight. There are testimonies from people who ignored these signs for months. One woman noticed eggs repeatedly appearing near her gate every few weeks. At first, she assumed children were playing cruel jokes. But then things started happening. Her husband became unusually angry all the time. Financial problems exploded without warning. Her children developed terrifying nightmares. Every night felt heavy. Every morning felt exhausting. The home no longer felt safe. And what shook her the most was when a former occult member explained that eggs are sometimes used symbolically in ritual practices connected to destruction, monitoring, or spiritual contamination. Again, the danger is not the object itself. The danger is the spiritual intention behind it. Because darkness operates through symbols, fear, and psychological entry points. This is why you cannot afford to remain spiritually asleep. You must become discerning. You must stop dismissing everything as coincidence. Not every strange thing is witchcraft, but not everything is innocent either. Discernment matters. Spiritual awareness matters. Prayer matters. Many people unknowingly allow fear to dominate them after discovering suspicious objects. That is exactly what darkness wants. Fear weakens spiritual confidence. Fear clouds judgment. Fear magnifies oppression. The moment you panic, you begin giving mental space to torment. And torment grows when fear feeds it. That is why you must respond with spiritual authority, instead of panic. Not superstition, not obsession. Authority. You cannot live terrified of every object outside your home, but you also cannot live spiritually careless. There must be balance. There must be wisdom. Some former occult insiders have described how certain rituals depend heavily on intimidation. The goal is psychological warfare, to make the target feel cursed, to make the target believe defeat has already entered their life, to make them spiritually exhausted before the real battle even begins. Because once the mind becomes consumed with fear, hopelessness follows, and hopelessness opens emotional doors. This is why spiritually strong people refuse to surrender mentally. They pray, they stay alert, they cover their homes spiritually, they refuse to allow darkness to dominate their thinking. There are families who suddenly began finding strange marks near their property, unusual symbols, powder spread across entrances, burned objects, small bags tied tightly with unknown contents inside. Some ignored it completely. Others became consumed with terror. But the wisest response was always spiritual discernment combined with prayerful action. Because spiritual warfare is real, not imaginary, not entertainment, not superstition-driven obsession. Real. Even in sacred scripture, physical objects were sometimes connected to spiritual influence, covenants, altars, and acts of rebellion. The spiritual realm has always used physical actions to represent deeper intentions. That reality should not terrify you. It should awaken you, because many believers are spiritually passive. They pray occasionally. They discern almost nothing. They ignore warning signs constantly. Then they wonder why confusion keeps growing around them. A spiritually alert person pays attention to atmospheres, to patterns, to disturbances, to sudden unexplained oppression, not with paranoia, with wisdom. One former occult practitioner revealed that dark workers often prefer targeting spiritually weak homes, homes filled with constant chaos, homes without prayer, homes dominated by bitterness, addiction, hatred, and division. Why? Because darkness looks for agreement. If a home is already drowning in anger and spiritual compromise, attacks become easier to establish emotionally. That is why protecting your atmosphere matters. What fills your home spiritually matters. What enters through screens matters. What conversations dominate your house matters. What attitudes control. Your environment matters because spiritual darkness thrives in certain conditions, and many people unknowingly nurture those conditions daily. Some homes are filled with non-stop hostility. Others are consumed with occult entertainment, constant fear, violent influences, or spiritually toxic practices. Then strange oppression begins appearing, not always because of external attacks, sometimes because internal doors were already wide open. You must understand this clearly. Darkness cannot overpower a spiritually grounded person who walks in faith, prayer, wisdom, and spiritual authority. That does not mean attacks never happen. It means attacks do not have final authority. And this is where many people lose the battle emotionally. They see one strange object. Then they immediately believe destruction is unavoidable. Number: fear is not your protector. Spiritual authority is. Prayer is. Discernment is. There are testimonies from people who removed suspicious objects while praying boldly over their homes and refused to allow fear to rule them. The atmosphere shifted, peace returned, clarity returned, strength returned, because darkness feeds on intimidation. But intimidation collapses when confronted by unwavering faith. You must stop underestimating the importance of spiritual covering over your home. Some people secure every physical door at night, but leave spiritual doors completely unguarded. No prayer life, no spiritual discipline, no discernment, authority. Then, when oppression appears, they feel defenseless. This is why spiritual preparation matters before attacks ever come. A spiritually prepared person does not collapse easily under pressure. And tonight, many people are beginning to realize something serious. Some battles were never physical alone. Some attacks carried spiritual roots. Some disturbances were connected to darkness attempting to gain emotional and spiritual influence. But this exposure is not happening to make you afraid. It is happening to wake you up. Because once you become spiritually alert, you stop living blindly. And once you stop living blindly, darkness loses one of its greatest advantages against you. Not every house becomes a battlefield overnight. Sometimes the attack begins slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. A strange heaviness enters first, then tension, then exhaustion, then constant confusion. And before long, the entire atmosphere inside the house changes. People stop talking peacefully. Sleep becomes restless. Arguments start exploding over small things. Fear increases without explanation. And many families never realize they are dealing with more than stress. Former occult insiders have repeatedly claimed that spiritually vulnerable homes are often viewed as easier targets, not because the people are weak physically, but because the spiritual walls around the home have been neglected for years. Some houses look beautiful outside, but spiritually they are collapsing inside. Constant hatred fills the rooms. Unforgiveness poisons conversations. Addictions dominate the environment. Dark influences enter daily through entertainment practices and destructive habits. And slowly, the atmosphere becomes spiritually polluted. That is why discernment matters more than appearances. A house can be expensive and still spiritually broken. A family can smile publicly while secretly drowning in oppression. One former practitioner described how darkness looks for entry through agreement. That statement terrified many people, because agreement does not always happen through rituals. Sometimes agreement happens through constant negativity, persistent hatred, violence, bitterness, spiritual compromise. The more darkness becomes normalized inside a home, the easier oppression begins spreading emotionally and mentally. This is why some homes constantly feel heavy even when nothing obvious is wrong. People walk inside and immediately feel drained. Tension hangs in the air. Peace feels absent. Joy disappears. Nobody understands why the environment feels suffocating. But spiritual atmospheres are real. What dominates a home eventually affects the people living inside it. There was a man who began finding strange objects near his property after a conflict with someone involved in occult practices. At first, he laughed it off, but then everything inside his home started changing. His children became unusually fearful at night. His wife struggled with crushing anxiety. Financial disasters suddenly multiplied. Arguments became non-stop. The entire house felt emotionally unstable. Then an elderly believer visited the home and immediately sensed something was wrong spiritually. Not because of magic, not because darkness was unstoppable, but because fear had already taken control of the family. That fear became the true battleground. Because once fear dominates a home, peace begins disappearing, and darkness thrives where panic rules. This is why spiritually mature people respond differently during spiritual attacks. They do not surrender emotionally. They pray with authority. They protect their atmosphere intentionally. They refuse to magnify darkness above God's power. Many people make the mistake of obsessing over curses instead of strengthening their spiritual foundation. That obsession becomes dangerous because constant fixation on darkness can slowly consume the mind. You were never meant to become fascinated with evil. You were meant to stand against it with wisdom and authority. Some individuals spend hours researching witchcraft science, but spend almost no time strengthening their prayer life. That imbalance creates spiritual weakness, because knowledge without spiritual grounding can easily become fear-driven obsession. And obsession traps people emotionally. There are families who become terrified over every noise outside, every shadow, every strange coincidence, every object near their gate. Eventually they stop, living in peace completely. That is not spiritual authority, that is emotional captivity. True spiritual authority remains calm even during warfare. It does not deny danger, but it refuses to bow to intimidation. Former occult testimonies often describe how intimidation itself becomes part of the strategy. The goal is to create mental collapse before anything else, because a fearful person becomes emotionally unstable. An unstable person becomes spiritually distracted, and distraction weakens. Discernment. This is why protecting your mind matters. You cannot allow fear to dominate your thoughts every day. Some viewers listening right now have already noticed strange patterns around their homes. Repeated disturbances, unusual atmosphere, sudden emotional heaviness. And deep inside, you know something feels wrong, but listen carefully. Do not respond with panic. Respond with spiritual discipline. Pray over your home consistently. Protect what enters your environment. Be careful what influences your household daily. Because spiritual warfare is not only about external attacks. Sometimes the greatest danger enters through repeated compromise inside the home itself. Many homes are spiritually unguarded because prayer disappeared years ago. People eat together, sleep together, watch television together. But nobody prays together anymore. Nobody spiritually covers the atmosphere anymore. Nobody guards the emotional condition of the home anymore. Then chaos gradually becomes normal. That is exactly how spiritual decline spreads quietly. One former occult member admitted that homes filled with division often became easier to influence emotionally. Why? Because division weakens unity, and unity carries spiritual strength. When a family constantly tears each other apart, emotional exhaustion grows, trust disappears, peace disappears, discernment weakens. People become vulnerable mentally and spiritually. This is why restoring peace inside your house matters deeply. Not fake peace, real peace, forgiveness, wisdom, prayer, self-control, spiritual discipline. These things strengthen the atmosphere around the family. Some people focus so heavily on external objects that they completely ignore internal darkness growing inside their own hearts. But bitterness can poison a home faster than any strange object left outside. Hatred can destroy families faster than fear ever could. Constant rage creates spiritual damage over time, and unresolved anger becomes an open wound, emotionally. You cannot fight darkness while feeding destructive patterns daily. That is why true spiritual protection begins internally first. A spiritually healthy home becomes harder to destabilize emotionally, not because attacks never come, but because the foundation remains strong during pressure. Some viewers listening tonight have been exhausted for months. You feel constant heaviness inside your home. You feel emotionally drained without explanation. You feel like peace vanished, suddenly. But this message is waking you up spiritually, not to terrify you, to prepare you. Because once you become spiritually alert, you stop ignoring what needs to change. You begin guarding your atmosphere differently. You begin praying differently. You begin discerning influences differently. And you stop giving fear permission to dominate your mind. One of the greatest mistakes people make during spiritual warfare is believing they are helpless. That is a lie. Darkness survives through intimidation and deception. But intimidation weakens when confronted with spiritual confidence. You must remember this tonight. Your home does not belong to fear. Your mind does not belong to torment. And your family does not have to remain trapped under spiritual heaviness forever. Because awareness changes battles, discernment changes responses, and spiritual authority changes atmospheres. The moment a person stops living spiritually asleep, everything begins shifting. Many attacks never begin with chaos. They begin with patterns, small disturbances, tiny warnings, subtle shifts that most people dismiss completely. That is why so many individuals remain trapped in spiritual battles for years without recognizing what is happening around them. Because darkness often moves quietly before it moves violently. Former occult insiders have repeatedly claimed that spiritual oppression sometimes starts with observation and psychological influence long before visible destruction appears. Goal is gradual weakening, gradual fear, gradual confusion. And the frightening part is this: many people ignore the warning signs until their entire emotional world begins collapsing. Some suddenly lose peace inside their homes for no clear reason. Others begin experiencing constant nightmares night after night. Some notice repeated strange occurrences near their property, unexplained objects, dead animals, symbols, burned materials, powders, bundles tied with thread or cloth. Again, not every strange object is witchcraft. But spiritually aware people do not ignore repeated disturbing patterns carelessly either. Discernment becomes essential. One former practitioner revealed that fear-based symbolism is commonly used to create emotional instability inside the target. Because when people become emotionally unstable, they become easier to torment mentally. That is why some attacks focus heavily on intimidation. The enemy wants you constantly anxious, constantly watching the windows, constantly terrified of every sound outside your house, constantly expecting disaster. And eventually your mind becomes exhausted. That exhaustion affects everything. Your focus weakens, your emotions weaken, your spiritual discipline weakens. This is why fear itself becomes one of the greatest weapons in spiritual warfare. Fear drains strength slowly. There was a woman who repeatedly found strange markings near her doorway every month. At first she ignored it, but over time she began noticing disturbing changes inside her home. Her children became aggressive toward one another. Her sleep became filled with terrifying dreams. Constant tension entered the house. Even visitors sensed heaviness in the atmosphere immediately after walking inside. Then one day she broke emotionally, not because of the objects, because fear had consumed her mind completely. She stopped sleeping peacefully, stopped thinking clearly, stopped functioning emotionally. And that is exactly where spiritual oppression becomes dangerous, not when objects appear, but when fear gains control internally. Because fear can imprison a person long before destruction ever manifests physically. This is why spiritually mature believers fight differently. They do not deny spiritual warfare exists, but they refuse to magnify darkness above truth. They refuse to surrender mentally. They refuse to allow panic to dominate their environment. Instead, they strengthen spiritual discipline. Prayer becomes consistent. Discernment becomes sharper. Faith becomes stronger. And the atmosphere begins changing. Some people listening right now have sensed something unusual around their homes for a long time. You noticed repeated disturbances, repeated heaviness, repeated emotional attacks. And deep inside, you kept asking yourself one question: why does this place suddenly feel spiritually different? Sometimes the answer is not external witchcraft at all. Sometimes the atmosphere changed because spiritual neglect opened emotional doors slowly over time. A home without peace eventually becomes vulnerable emotionally. A home filled with rage creates constant tension. A home consumed with addiction, hatred, corruption, or toxic influences begins attracting emotional darkness naturally. That is why spiritual maintenance matters constantly. You cannot fill a home with chaos daily and expect peace to remain strong automatically. Atmospheres are shaped by what dominates them consistently. Former occult. Testimonies often mention how spiritually disciplined individuals became difficult to intimidate. Why? Because spiritually grounded people understand authority, they understand peace, they understand discernment, and most importantly, they understand fear is not supposed to control them. One of the most dangerous things happening today is that many people are spiritually asleep while emotionally overwhelmed. They are exhausted constantly, distracted constantly, mentally drained constantly. Because of that exhaustion, they stop paying attention to what is happening around them spiritually. Some homes begin experiencing non-stop conflict after certain individuals visit repeatedly. Others notice emotional heaviness increasing after involvement with spiritually dangerous practices. Some dabble in occult games, rituals, fortune-telling, spiritual shortcuts, or dark entertainment without realizing the emotional impact these influences can create over time. Then confusion begins spreading, slowly. This is why spiritual boundaries matter, not legalism, wisdom, because everything you repeatedly allow into your environment shapes the atmosphere around you eventually. Some viewers have unknowingly opened emotional doors through constant fear-based content. Every day becomes filled with darkness, paranoia, obsession, and anxiety. Eventually, peace disappears completely. That is not discernment anymore. That is spiritual exhaustion. You were never created to live terrified constantly. You are created to stand spiritually awake and emotionally stable. That stability becomes powerful during warfare because darkness expects collapse, it expects panic, it expects hopelessness. But spiritually mature people respond differently under pressure. They pray before fear spreads, they guard their atmosphere carefully, they refuse to feed torment mentally, and that response weakens intimidation dramatically. There are testimonies from individuals who completely transformed the atmosphere inside their homes through consistent spiritual discipline, not through superstition, not through rituals, through prayer, peace, wisdom, faith, spiritual authority. One family described how their home once felt unbearably heavy every night. Arguments never stopped. Fear dominated the children constantly. Emotional exhaustion consumed everyone. But everything slowly changed when the family began intentionally restoring spiritual discipline inside the house. They stopped feeding toxic influences. They stopped living in non-stop conflict. They started praying consistently together. Peace gradually returned. Clarity returned. Strength returned. And the atmosphere changed completely. Because darkness loses influence when healthy spiritual foundations become strong again. This is what many people fail to understand. Spiritual warfare is not only about resisting external attacks, it is also about strengthening internal foundations. A fearful mind becomes vulnerable. A divided home becomes unstable. An undisciplined atmosphere becomes weak emotionally. But a spiritually grounded environment becomes harder to shake. That does not mean attacks disappear instantly. It means fear stops controlling the outcome. And tonight, many people are realizing something important for the first time. Some signs were warnings, some patterns were indicators, some atmospheres were crying out for spiritual attention. But instead of responding with wisdom, many people either ignored everything or became consumed by fear entirely. Both responses are dangerous. You need discernment, calmness, spiritual awareness, and unwavering authority, because darkness survives through confusion. But confusion weakens when truth enters the room. And once a person becomes spiritually awake, intimidation no longer controls them the same way again. The greatest victory in spiritual warfare often begins with one decision: refusing to live afraid anymore. Because fear changes people, fear drains strength, fear weakens discernment. Fear turns homes into emotional prisons, and many people have unknowingly lived under that pressure for years. They hear strange noises and immediately panic. They see suspicious objects and immediately assume destruction is coming. They notice disturbances around their homes and instantly feel hopeless. That emotional surrender becomes dangerous, because darkness wants your agreement emotionally before anything else. Former occult insiders have described how intimidation plays a major role in spiritual attacks. Not because darkness is all-powerful, but because frightened people often defeat themselves mentally before the real battle even begins. That is why taking back your home starts internally first. You must reclaim peace in your mind. You must reject panic. You must stop feeding torment with constant fear and obsession. Some people spend every day searching for signs of witchcraft everywhere. Every shadow terrifies them. Every stranger worries them. Every object becomes a threat in their imagination. Eventually, they lose emotional stability completely. That is not spiritual wisdom. That is emotional captivity. A spiritually grounded person remains alert without becoming consumed. Discernment does not produce paranoia. True discernment produces clarity, and clarity becomes powerful during warfare. One former practitioner admitted that spiritually disciplined homes became difficult to intimidate emotionally. Why? Because peace creates strength, unity creates strength, prayer creates strength, and fear loses power where spiritual confidence grows consistently. There was a family who lived under constant heaviness for years. Nightmares tormented the children. Arguments consumed the parents daily. Financial pressure exploded repeatedly. The atmosphere inside the home felt oppressive constantly. Then one day the father realized something painful. The family had become spiritually disconnected completely. Nobody prayed anymore. Nobody protected the atmosphere of the home intentionally. Anger filled the rooms daily. Entertainment filled every silence. Tension ruled the environment constantly, and slowly the house became emotionally exhausted. Everything changed when they decided to rebuild the spiritual condition of their home intentionally, not with rituals, not with superstition, with discipline. Prayer returned consistently. Peaceful communication returned intentionally. Toxic influences were removed gradually. Fear stopped dominating conversations. And over time, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The heaviness weakened, clarity returned. The children became calmer emotionally. Hope returned to the house again. Because spiritual atmospheres respond to what consistently governs them. Some viewers listening tonight have allowed fear to become the loudest voice in their home. Every conversation revolves around anxiety. Every thought revolves around danger. Every night revolves around panic. But fear is not supposed to become the ruler of your environment. Peace is. Wisdom is. Spiritual authority is. You must understand something important. Darkness wants emotional surrender more than anything else. Because once hopelessness enters a person deeply, strength begins collapsing slowly. That is why spiritually mature people protect their minds carefully during warfare. They do not meditate constantly on evil, they meditate on truth. They strengthen faith daily. They remain spiritually disciplined daily, and they refuse to allow darkness to dominate their thinking patterns. Some people unknowingly increase fear inside their homes through non-stop obsession with dark content, hour after hour of fear-driven videos, constant conversations about curses, constant anxiety about attacks. Eventually, the atmosphere becomes emotionally toxic. Everyone inside the house begins feeling overwhelmed. That is not spiritual awareness anymore. That is emotional poisoning. You must guard your atmosphere intentionally. What enters your home repeatedly matters deeply. What controls conversations matters deeply. What influences your emotions daily matters deeply. Because atmospheres shape people slowly over time. One former occult insider revealed something shocking. Many attacks failed completely against individuals who remained spiritually calm and grounded. That statement carries power. Because calmness during warfare is not weakness, it is confidence. Confidence that fear does not have final authority. Confidence that darkness does not own your home. Confidence that intimidation does not control your future. This is why spiritual discipline matters before crises even begin. A spiritually prepared person responds differently during pressure. Instead of collapsing emotionally, they become focused. Instead of feeding panic, they strengthen peace. Instead of obsessing over darkness, they strengthen truth. And that response changes the atmosphere dramatically. Some viewers tonight need to reclaim their homes emotionally first. Because the real oppression has been fear itself. Fear destroyed your sleep. Fear consumed your thoughts. Fear poisoned your peace. Fear exhausted your family emotionally. But tonight something is changing. Awareness is returning. Strength is returning. Discernment is returning. And once discernment awakens, intimidation loses power. You no longer ignore dangerous patterns blindly, but you also stop surrendering emotionally to terror. You become spiritually balanced, alert, focused, grounded, and that balance becomes dangerous to darkness. Some homes need restoration more than deliverance. Restoration of peace, restoration of discipline, restoration of unity, restoration of healthy spiritual foundations. Because a divided atmosphere weakens people emotionally, but a peaceful atmosphere strengthens resilience. One of the most powerful things you can do is refuse to let darkness dictate the emotional climate inside your house anymore. Refuse to normalize constant rage. Refuse to normalize fear-driven living. Refuse to normalize spiritual neglect. Protect your atmosphere intentionally. build peace intentionally, strengthen spiritual discipline intentionally, and stop underestimating the importance of what fills your environment daily. Because homes are shaped slowly by repeated influences. And many people are finally realizing tonight that spiritual warfare is not only about strange objects outside, it is also about what has been growing inside unnoticed for years: fear, division, bitterness, neglect, emotional exhaustion. These things weaken homes quietly. But once spiritual awareness returns, rebuilding becomes possible. And this is where everything changes, because darkness expects you to remain passive, fearful, distracted, emotionally broken. But the moment you stand spiritually awake with clarity and discipline, the atmosphere begins shifting immediately. Not because intimidation vanished overnight, because you stopped surrendering to it. And once fear loses control over your mind, darkness loses one of its strongest weapons against you. Tonight your eyes have been opened. You now understand that not every battle is physical, and not every attack begins with noise. But fear no longer has authority over your home. Darkness loses power when you stand spiritually awake, disciplined, and unshaken. You are not called to panic. You are called to stand. Let peace return to your house. Strength return to your spirit. Let discernment rise inside you like fire. And from this moment forward, every atmosphere of intimidation must break, because you refuse to live spiritually asleep ever again.